Welcome to the Chris and Tyson podcast, where stories come to life. I'm Chris.
And I'm Tyson. Today, our guest is Henry Silverstein. Henry has been a fiction enthusiast for almost 18 years and has dedicated a lot of his time to analyzing literature and short stories. He's also quite incredibly handsome and intelligent, and much smarter than the two of us. His qualifications of writing fiction transcends our personal knowledge and understanding of modern fiction today. How was your morning, Henry?
Thank you, Tyson. I'm doing great, and I'm so happy to be here.
I'm glad you're doing well. What do you have for us today?
Today, I will be reading a short story called Cathedral, written by an American writer and poet, Raymond Carver. It is the title story of a collection published in 1983, also called Cathedral. With his publication, Carver finally received the critical praise he long hoped for. Cathedral is generally considered to be one of Carver's finest works, displaying both his expertise in crafting a minimalist story and also writing about catharsis with such simple storylines.
Is there anything in particular that made you want to present this story to us?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting short story. As I said, it has quite a simple plot, but the perspective is really interesting, as well as it has a first-person narrator, which I found very compelling in the way that it presents the characters in the story.
That sounds great. Just a small disclaimer before we begin. This piece may contain some outdated and offensive language that we left in order to preserve the nature and integrity of the story.
Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy this podcast.
Cathedral by Raymond Carver, 1981. This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. His wife had died, so he was visiting the dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. He called my wife from his in-laws. Arrangements were made. He would come by train, a 5-hour trip, and my wife would meet him at the station. She hadn't seen him since she worked for him one summer in Seattle 10 years ago, but she and the blind man had kept in touch. They made tapes and mailed them back and forth. I wasn't enthusiastic about his visit. He was no one I knew, and his being blind bothered me. My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed. Sometimes they were led by seeing-eyed dogs. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to. That summer in Seattle, she had needed a job. She didn't have any money. The man she was going to marry at the end of the summer was an officer's training school. He didn't have any money either, but she was in love with the guy, and he was in love with her, etc. She'd seen something in the paper, help wanted, reading to a blind man, and a telephone number. She phoned and went over, was hired on the spot. She worked with this blind man all summer. She read stuff to him, case studies, reports, that sort of thing. She helped him organize his little office in the county social service department. They'd become good friends, my wife and the blind man. On her last day in the office, the blind man asked if he could touch her face. She agreed to this. She told me he touched his fingers to every part of her face, her nose, even her neck. She never forgot it. She even tried to write a poem about it. She was always trying to write a poem. She wrote a poem or two every year, usually after something really important had happened to her. When we first started going out together, she showed me the poem. In the poem, she recalled his fingers and the way they had moved around her face. In the poem, she talked about what she had felt at the time, about what went through her mind when the blind man touched her nose and lips. I can remember I didn't think much of the poem. Of course, I didn't tell her that. Maybe I just don't understand poetry. I admit it's not the first thing I reach for when I pick up something to read. Anyway, this man who'd first enjoyed her favors, this officer-to-be, he'd been her childhood sweetheart. So okay, I'm saying that at the end of the summer, she let the blind man run his hands over her face, said goodbye to him, married her childhood, etc., who was now a commissioned officer, and she moved away from Seattle. But they kept in touch, she and the blind man. She made the first contact after a year or so. She called him up one night from an Air Force base in Alabama. She wanted to talk. They talked. He asked her to send him a tape and tell him about her life. She did this. She sent the tape. On the tape, she told the blind man she loved her husband, but she didn't like it where they lived, and she didn't like it that he was a part of the military-industrial thing. She told the blind man she'd written a poem, and he was in it. She told him she was writing a poem about what it was like to be an Air Force officer's wife. The poem wasn't finished yet. She was still writing it. The blind man made a tape. He sent her the tape. She made a tape. This went on for years. My wife's officer was posted to one base and then another. She sent tapes from Moody, AFB, McGuire, McConnell, and finally Travis near Sacramento, where one night she got to feeling lonely and cut off from the people she kept losing in that moving around life. She got to feeling she couldn't go at another step. She went in and swallowed all the pills and capsules in the medicine chest and washed them down with a bottle of gin. Then she got into a hot bath and passed out. But instead of dying, she got sick. She threw up. Her officer, why should he have a name? He was a childhood sweetheart. What more does he want? Came from somewhere, found her, and called the ambulance. In time, she put it all on tape and sent the tape to the blind man. Over the years, she put all kinds of stuff on tapes and sent the tapes off lickety-split. Next to writing a poem every year, I think it was her chief means of recreation. On one tape, she told the blind man she decided to live away from her officer for a time. On another tape, she told him about her divorce. She and I began going out, and of course she told her blind man about it. She told him everything, or so it seemed to me. Once she asked me if I'd like to hear the latest tape from the blind man. This was a year ago. I was on the tape, she said. So I said okay, I'd listen to it. I got us drinks, and we settled down in the living room. We made ready to listen. First, she inserted the tape into the player and adjusted a couple of dials. Then she pushed a lever. The tape squeaked and someone began to talk in this loud voice. She lowered the volume. After a few minutes of harmless chit-chat, I heard my own name in the mouth of the stranger, the blind man I didn't even know. And then this. From all you said about him, I can only conclude. But we were interrupted. A knock at the door, something, and we didn't ever get back to the tape. Maybe it was just as well. I'd heard all I wanted to. Now this same blind man was coming over to sleep in my house. Maybe I could take him bowling, I said to my wife. She was at the draining board doing some scalloped potatoes. She put down the knife she was using and turned around.
If you love me,
She said,
you can do this for me. If you don't love me, okay. But if you had a friend, any friend, and the friend came to visit, I would make him feel comfortable.
She wiped her hands with the dish towel. I don't have any blind friends, I said.
You don't have any friends.
She said.
Period. Besides.
She said.
God damn it, his wife's just died. Don't you understand that? The man's lost his wife.
I didn't answer. She told me a little about the blind man's wife. Her name was Beulah. Beulah, that's the name for a colored woman. Was his wife a Negro, I asked.
Are you crazy?
My wife said.
Have you just flipped or something?
She picked up a potato. I saw it hit the floor, then roll under the stove.
What's wrong with you?
She said.
Are you drunk?
I'm just asking, I said. Right then, my wife filled me in with more detail than I cared to know. I made a drink and sat down at the kitchen table to listen. Pieces of the story began falling into place. Beulah had gone to work for the blind man the summer after my wife had stopped working for him. Pretty soon, Beulah and the blind man had themselves a church wedding. It was a little wedding. Who'd want to go to such a wedding in the first place? Just the two of them, plus the minister and the minister's wife. But it was a church wedding just the same. It was what Beulah had wanted, he said. But even then, Beulah must have been carrying the cancer in her glands. After they had been inseparable for 8 years, my wife's word, inseparable, Beulah's health went into a rapid decline. She died in a Seattle hospital room, the blind man sitting beside the bed and holding onto her hand. They'd married, lived and worked together, slept together, had sex, sure, and the blind man had to bury her. All this without his having ever seen what the goddamn woman looked like. It was beyond my understanding. Hearing this, I felt sorry for the blind man for a little bit, and then I found myself thinking what a pitiful life this woman must have led. Imagine a woman who could never see herself as she was seen in the eyes of her loved one. A woman who could go on day after day and never receive the smallest compliment from her beloved. A woman whose husband could never read the expression on her face, be it misery or something better. Someone who could wear makeup or not, what difference to him? She could, if she wanted, wear green eyeshadow around one eye, a straight pin in her nostril, yellow slacks, and purple shoes, no matter. And then, to slip off into death, the blind man's hand on her hand, his blind eyes streaming tears. I'm imagining now. Her last thought may be this, that he never even knew what she looked like. And she on an express to the grave. Robert was left with a small insurance policy and half of a 20 peso Mexican coin. The other half of the coin went into the box with her. Pathetic. So when the time rolled around, my wife went to the depot to pick him up, with nothing to do but wait. Sure, I blamed him for that. I was having a drink and watching the TV when I heard the car pull into the drive. I got up from the sofa with my drink and went to the window to have a look. I saw my wife laughing as she parked the car. I saw her get out of the car and shut the door. She was still wearing a smile. Just amazing. She went around to the other side of the car where the blind man was already starting to get out. This blind man, feature this, he was wearing a full beard. A beard on a blind man. Too much, I say. The blind man reached into the back seat and dragged out a suitcase. My wife took his arm, shut the car door, and, talking all the way, moved him down the drive and then up the steps to the front porch. I turned off the TV. I finished my drink, rinsed the glass, dried my hands, then I went to the door. My wife said,
I want you to meet Robert. Robert, this is my husband. I've told you all about him.
She was beaming. She had this blind man by his coat sleeve. The blind man let go of his suitcase and up came his hand. I took it. He squeezed hard, held my hand, and then he let it go.
I feel like we've already met.
He boomed. Likewise, I said. I didn't know what else to say. Then I said, welcome, I've heard a lot about you. We began to move then, a little group, from the porch in the living room, my wife guiding him by the arm. The blind man was carrying a suitcase in his other hand. My wife said things like,
To your left here, Robert. That's right. Now watch it. There's a chair. That's it. Sit down right there. This is the sofa. We just bought this sofa 2 weeks ago.
I started to say something about the old sofa. I'd like that old sofa, but I didn't say anything. Then I wanted to say something else, small talk, about a scenic ride along the Hudson, how going to New York you should sit on the right-hand side of the train, and coming from New York, the left-hand side. Did you have a good train ride, I asked? Which side of the train did you sit on, by the way?
What a question. Which side?
My wife said.
What's it matter which side?
She said. I just asked, I said.
Right side.
The blind man said.
I hadn't been on a train in nearly 40 years, not since I was a kid, with my folks. That's been a long time. I've nearly forgotten the sensation. I have winter in my beard now.
He said.
So I've told, anyway. Do I look distinguished, my dear?
The blind man said to my wife.
You look distinguished, Robert.
She said.
Robert?
She said.
Robert, it's just so good to see you.
My wife finally took her eyes off the blind man and looked at me. I had the feeling that she didn't like what she saw. I shrugged. I never met or personally known anyone who's blind. This blind man was late 40s, a heavy-set, balding man with stooped shoulders, as if he carried a great weight there. He wore brown slacks, brown shoes, a light brown shirt, a tie, a sports coat. Spiffy. He also had this full beard, but he didn't use a cane and he didn't wear dark glasses. I'd always thought dark glasses were a must for the blind. Fact was, I wish he had a pair. At first glance, his eyes looked like anyone else's, but if you looked close, there was something different about him. Too much white in the iris, for one thing, and the pupils seemed to move around in the sockets without his knowing it or being able to stop it. Creepy. As I stared at his face, I saw the left pupil turn in toward his nose, while the other made an effort to keep in one place. But it was only an effort, for that one eye was on the roam without his knowing it or wanting it to be. I said, "Let me get you a drink. What's your pleasure? We have a little bit of everything. It's one of our pastimes."
Bub, I'm a Scotch man myself.
He said, fast enough in this big voice. Right, I said. Bub, sure you are. I knew it. He let his fingers touch his suitcase, which was sitting alongside the sofa. He was taking his bearings. I didn't blame him for that.
I'll move that up to your room.
My wife said.
No, that's fine.
The blind man said loudly.
It can go up when I go up.
A little water with the scotch, I said.
Very little.
He said. I knew it, I said. He said.
Just a tad. The Irish actor, Barry Fitzgerald? I'm like that fellow. When I drink water, Fitzgerald said, I drink water. When I drink whiskey, I drink whiskey.
My wife laughed. The blind man brought his hand up under his beard. He lifted his beard slowly and let it drop. I did the drinks, 3 big glasses of scotch with a splash of water in each. Then we made ourselves comfortable and talked about Robert's travels. First, the long flight from the West Coast to Connecticut. We covered that. Then, from Connecticut up here by train, we had another drink concerning that leg of the trip. I remembered having read somewhere that the blind didn't smoke because, as speculation had it, they couldn't see the smoke they exhaled. I thought I knew that much, and that much only about blind people. But this blind man smoked his cigarette down to the nubbin and then lit another one. This blind man filled his ashtray and my wife emptied it. When we sat down at the table for dinner, we had another drink. My wife heaped Robert's plate with cube steak, scalloped potatoes, green beans. I buttered him up 2 slices of bread. I said, "Here's some better butter for you." I swallowed some of my drink. "Now let us pray," I said, and the blind man lowered his head. My wife looked at me, her mouth agape. "Pray the phone won't ring and the food doesn't get cold," I said. We dug in. We ate everything there was to eat on the table. We ate like there was no tomorrow. We didn't talk. We ate. We scarfed. We grazed the table. We were into serious eating. The blind man had right away located his foods. He knew just where everything was on his plate. I watched with admiration as he used his knife and fork on the meat. He'd cut 2 pieces of the meat, fork the meat into his mouth, and then go all out for the scalloped potatoes. The beans next, and then he'd tear off a hunk of butter bread and eat that. He'd follow this up with a big drink of milk. It didn't seem to bother him to use his fingers once in a while either. We finished everything, including half a strawberry pie. For a few moments, we sat as if stunned. Sweat beaded on our faces. Finally, we got up from the table and left the dirty plates. We didn't look back. We took ourselves into the living room and sank into our places again. Robert and my wife sat on the sofa. I took the big chair. We had us 2 or 3 more drinks while they talked about the major things that had come to pass for them in the past 10 years. For the most part, I just listened. Now and then I joined in. I didn't want to let him think that I'd left the room, and I didn't want her to think I was feeling left out. They talked of things that had happened to them, in the past 10 years. I waited in vain to hear my name on my wife's sweet lips.
And then my dear husband came into my life.
Something like that. But I heard nothing of the sort. More talk of Robert. Robert had done a little of everything, it seemed. A regular blind jack of all trades. But most recently, he and his wife had an Amway distributorship, from which I gathered they earned a living, such as it was. The blind man was also a ham radio operator. He talked in his loud voice about conversations he had with fellow operators in Guam, in the Philippines, in Alaska, even in Tahiti. He said he'd have a lot of friends there if she ever wanted to go visit those places. From time to time, he turned his blind face towards me, put his hand under his beard, asked me something. How long had I been in my present position? 3 years. Did I like my work? I didn't. Was I going to stay with it? What were the options? Finally, when I thought he was beginning to run down, I got up and turned on the TV. My wife looked at me with irritation. She was heading towards a boil. Then she looked at the blind man and said,
Robert, do you have a TV?
The blind man said,
My dear, I have 2 TVs. I have a color set and a black and white thing, an old relic. It's funny, but if I turn the TV on, and I'm always turning it on, I turn on the color set. It's funny, don't you think?
I didn't know what to say to that. I had absolutely nothing to say to that. No opinion. So I watched the news program and tried to listen to what the announcer was saying.
This is a color TV.
The blind man said.
Don't ask me how, but I can tell.
We traded up a while ago, I said. The blind man had another taste of his drink. He lifted his beard, sniffed it, and let it fall. He leaned forward on the sofa. He positioned his ashtray on the coffee table, and then put the lighter to his cigarette. He leaned back on the sofa and crossed his legs at the ankles. My wife covered her mouth and then yawned. She stretched. She said,
I think I'll go upstairs and put on my robe. I'll change into something else. Robert, you make yourself comfortable.
She said.
I'm comfortable.
The blind man said.
I want you to feel comfortable in this house.
She said.
I'm comfortable.
The blind man said. After she left the room, he and I listened to the weather report and then the sports roundup. By that time, she'd been gone so long I didn't know she was going to come back. I thought she might have gone to bed. I wished she'd come back downstairs. I didn't want to be left alone with a blind man. I asked him if he wanted another drink, and he said sure. Then I asked if he wanted to smoke some dope with me. I said I'd just rolled a number. I hadn't, but I planned to do so in about 2 shakes.
I'll try some with you.
He said. Damn right, I said. That's the stuff. I got our drinks and sat down on the sofa with him. Then I rolled us 2 fat numbers. I lit one and passed it. I brought it to his fingers. He took it and inhaled. Hold it as long as you can, I said. I could tell he didn't know the first thing. My wife came back downstairs wearing her pink robe and her pink slippers.
What do I smell?
She said. We thought we'd have us some cannabis, I said. My wife gave me a savage look. Then she looked at the blind man and said,
Robert, I didn't know you smoked.
He said,
I do now, my dear. There's a first time for everything, but I don't feel anything yet.
This stuff is pretty mellow, I said. This stuff is mild. It's dope you can reason with, I said. It doesn't mess you up.
Not much it doesn't, bub.
He said and laughed. My wife sat on the sofa between the blind man and me. I passed her the number. She took it and toked and then passed it to me.
Which way is this going?
She said. Then she said,
I shouldn't be smoking this. I could hardly keep my eyes open as it is. That dinner did me in. I shouldn't have eaten so much.
It was the strawberry pie.
the blind man said.
That's what did it.
He said, and he laughed his big laugh. Then he shook his head. There's more strawberry pie, I said.
Do you want some, Robert?
My wife said.
Maybe in a little while.
He said. We gave our attention to the TV. My wife yawned again. She said,
Your bed is made up when you feel like going to bed, Robert. I know you must have had a long day. When you're ready to go to bed, say so.
She pulled his arm.
Robert?
He came to and said,
I've had a real nice time. This beats tapes, doesn't it?
I said, coming at you, and I put the number between his fingers. He inhaled, held the smoke, and then let it go. It was like he'd been doing this since he was 9 years old.
Thanks, bub.
He said.
But I think this is all for me. I think I'm beginning to feel it.
He said. He held the burning roach out for my wife.
Same here.
She said.
Ditto. Me too.
She took the roach and passed it to me.
I may just sit there for a while between you two guys with my eyes closed. But don't let me bother you, okay? Either one of you. If it bothers you, say so. Otherwise, I may just sit here with my eyes closed until you're ready to go to bed.
She said.
Your bed's made up, Robert, when you're ready. It's right next to our room at the top of the stairs. We'll show you up when you're ready. You wake me up now, you guys, if I fall asleep.
She said that, and then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. The news program ended. I got up and changed the channel. I sat back down on the sofa. I wish my wife hadn't pooped out. Her head lay across the back of the sofa, her mouth open. She turned so that her robe had slipped away from her legs, exposing a juicy thigh. I reached to draw her robe back over, and it was then that I glanced at the blind man. What the hell? I flipped the robe open again. You say when you want some strawberry pie, I said.
I will.
He said. I said, are you tired? Do you want me to take you up to your bed? Are you ready to hit the hay?
Not yet.
He said.
No, I'll stay up with you, bub, if that's all right. I'll stay up until you're ready to turn in. We haven't had the chance to talk. Know what I mean? I feel like me and her monopolized the evening.
He lifted his beard and let it fall. He picked up his cigarettes and his lighter. That's all right, he said. Then I said, I'm glad for the company. And I guess I was. Every night I smoked dope and stayed up as long as I could before I fell asleep. My wife and I hardly ever went back to bed at the same time. When I did go to sleep, I had these dreams. Sometimes I'd wake up from one of them, my heart going crazy. Something about the church in the Middle Ages was on the TV. Not your run-of-the-mill TV fare. I wanted to watch something else. I turned to the other channels, but there was nothing on them either. So I turned back to the first channel and apologized.
Bub, it's all right.
The blind man said.
It's fine with me. Whatever you want to watch is okay. I'm always learning something. Learning never ends. It won't hurt me to learn something tonight. I got ears.
He said. We didn't say anything for a time. He was leaning forward with his head turned to me, his right ear aimed in the direction of the set. Very disconcerting. Now and then his eyelids drooped, and then they snapped open again. Now and then he put his fingers into his beard and tugged, like he was thinking about something he was hearing on the television. On the screen, a group of men wearing towels was being set upon and tormented by men dressed in skeleton costumes and men dressed as devils. The men dressed as devils wore devil masks, horns, and long tails. This pageant was a part of a procession. The Englishman who was narrating the thing said it took place in Spain once a year. I tried to explain to the blind man what was happening.
Skeletons.
He said.
I know about skeletons.
He said, and he nodded. The TV showed this one cathedral. There was a long, slow look at another. Finally, the picture switched to the famous one in Paris, with its fine buttresses and its spires reaching up to the clouds. The camera pulled away to show the whole of the cathedral rising above the skyline. There were times when the Englishman who was telling the thing would shut up, or simply let the camera move over the cathedrals, or else the camera would tour the countryside, men in fields walking behind oxen. I waited as long as I could. Then I felt I had to say something. I said, "They're showing the outside of this cathedral now. Gargoyles, little statues carved to look like monsters. Now I guess they're in Italy." "Yeah, they're in Italy. There's paintings on the walls of this one church."
Are those fresco painting, bub?
He asked, and he sipped from his drink. I reached for my glass, but it was empty. I tried to remember what I could remember. "You asking me about those frescoes?" I said. "That's a good question. I don't know." The camera moved to a cathedral outside Lisbon. The difference in the Portuguese cathedral compared with the French and Italian were not that great, but they were there, mostly the interior stuff. Then something occurred to me, and I said, "Something has occurred to me. Do you have any idea what a cathedral is? What they look like, that is? Do you follow me? If somebody says cathedral to you, do you have any notion what they're talking about? Do you the difference between that and a Baptist church, say?" He let the smoke dribble from his mouth.
I know they took hundreds of workers 50 or 100 years to build.
He said.
I just heard the man say that, of course. I know generations of the same families worked on a cathedral. I heard him say that too. The men who began their life's work on them. They never lived to see the completion of their work. In that wise, bub, they're no different from the rest of us, right?
He laughed. Then his eyelids drooped again. His head nodded. He seemed to be snoozing. Maybe he was imagining himself in Portugal. The TV was showing another cathedral now. This one's in Germany. The Englishman's voice droned on.
Cathedrals.
The blind man said. He sat up and rolled his head back and forth.
If you want the truth, bub, that's about all I know. What I just said, what I heard him say. But maybe you could describe one to me? I wish you'd do it. I'd like that. If you want to know, I really don't have a good idea.
I stared hard at the shot of the cathedral on the TV. How could I even begin to describe it? But say my life depended on it. Say my life was being threatened by an insane guy who said I had to do it or else. I stared some more at the cathedral before the picture flipped off into the countryside. There was no use. I turned to the blind man and said, "To begin with, they're very tall." I was looking around the room for clues. They reach way up and up towards the sky. They're so big, some of them, they have to have these supports to help hold them up, so to speak. These supports are called buttresses. They remind of viaducts for some reason. But maybe you don't know viaducts either. Sometimes the cathedrals have devils and such carved into the front. Sometimes lords and ladies. Don't ask me why this is, I said. He was nodding. The whole upper part of his body seemed to be moving back and forth. "I'm not doing so good, am I?" I said. He stopped nodding and leaned forward into the edge of the sofa. As he listened to me, he was running his fingers through his beard. I wasn't getting through to him, I could see that. But he waited for me to go on just the same. He nodded like he was trying to encourage me. I tried to think what else to say. "They're really big," I said. "They're massive. They're built of stone. Marble too, sometimes. In those olden days, when they built cathedrals, men wanted to be close to God. In those olden days, God was an important part of everyone's life. You could tell this from the cathedral building." "I'm sorry," I said, "but it looks like that's the best I can do for you. I'm just no good at it,"
That's all right, bub.
the blind man said.
Hey, listen. I hope you don't mind me asking you. Can I ask you something? Let me ask you a simple question, yes or no. I'm just curious, and there's no offense. You're my host. But let me ask you if you are in any way religious. You don't mind me asking?
I shook my head. He couldn't see that, though. A wink is the same as a nod to a blind man. "I guess I don't believe in it. In anything. Sometimes it's hard, you know what I'm saying?"
Sure, I do.
He said. "Right," I said. The Englishman was still holding forth. My wife sighed in her sleep. She drew a long breath and went on with her sleeping. "You'll have to forgive me," I said, "but I can't tell you what a cathedral looks like. It just isn't in me to do it. I can't do any more than I've done." The blind man sat very still, his head down, as he listened to me. I said, "The truth is, cathedrals don't mean anything special to me. Nothing. Cathedrals. There's something to look at on late night TV. That's all they are." It was then that the blind man cleared his throat. He brought something up. He took a handkerchief from his back pocket. Then he said,
I get it, bub. It's okay. It happens. Don't worry about it.
he said,
Hey, listen to me. Will you do me a favor? I got an idea. Why don't you find us some heavy paper and a pen? We'll do something. We'll draw one together. Get us a pen and some heavy paper. Go on, bub. Get the stuff.
he said. So I went upstairs. My legs felt like they didn't have any strength in them. They felt like they did after I'd done some running. In my wife's room, I looked around. I found some ballpoints in a little basket on her table, and then I tried to think where to look for the kind of paper he was talking about. Downstairs in the kitchen, I found a shopping bag with onion skins in the bottom of the bag. I emptied the bag and shook it. I brought it into the living room and sat it down near his legs. I moved some things, smoothed the wrinkles from the bag, spread it out on the coffee table. The blind man got down from the sofa and sat next to me on the carpet. He ran his fingers over the paper. He went up and down the sides of the paper. The edges, even the edges. He fingered the corners.
All right.
He said.
All right, let's do her.
He found my hand, the hand with the pen. He closed his hand over my hand.
Go ahead, bub. Draw.
He said.
Draw. You'll see. I'll follow along with you. It'll be okay. Just begin now, like I'm telling you. You'll see. Draw.
The blind man said. So I began. First I drew a box that looked like a house. It could have been the house I lived in. Then I put a roof on it. At either end of the roof, I drew spires. Crazy.
Swell.
He said.
Terrific. You're doing fine.
He said.
Never thought anything like this could happen in your lifetime, did you, bub? Well, it's a strange life. We all know that. Go on now. Keep it up.
I put in windows with arches. I drew flying buttresses. I hung great doors. I couldn't stop. The TV station went off in the air. I put down the pen and closed and opened my fingers. The blind man felt around over the paper. He moved the tips of his fingers over the paper, all over what I had drawn, and he nodded.
Doing fine.
The blind man said. I took up the pen again, and he found my hand. I kept at it. I'm no artist, but I kept drawing just the same. My wife opened up her eyes and gazed at us. She sat up on the sofa, her robe hanging open. She said,
What are you doing? Tell me. I want to know.
I didn't answer her. The blind man said,
We're drawing a cathedral. Me and him are working on it. Press hard.
He said to me.
That's right. That's good.
He said.
Sure, you got it, bub. I can tell. You didn't think you could, but you can, can't you? You're cooking with gas now. You know what I'm saying? We're going to really have it something here in a minute. How's the old arm?
He said.
Put some people in there now. What's a cathedral without people?
My wife said.
What's going on? Robert, what are you doing? What's going on?
It's all right.
He said to her.
Close your eyes now.
The blind man said to me. I did it. I closed them just like he said.
Are they closed?
He said.
Don't fudge.
They're closed, I said.
Keep them that way.
He said. He said.
Don't stop now. Draw.
So we kept on with it. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper. It was like nothing else in my life up to now. Then he said.
I think that's it. I think you got it.
He said.
Take a look. What do you think?
But I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep them that way for a little longer. I thought it was something I ought to do.
Well?
He said.
Are you looking?
My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything. It's really something, I said.
Thank you for the amazing story, Henry.
Yeah, Henry, that sounded great.
Thank you.
Let's talk about a few parts of the story that contribute to its meaning. I think we should talk about its perspective. I noticed that throughout the entire piece, we see only from the perspective and thoughts of one character.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The perspective is very interesting throughout the entire work. I especially think when the author is introducing new characters through the perspective of the narrator, it definitely changes the experience for the reader. I think about when the blind man first gets to their house and he's first looking him up and down and he sees his beard, and that's really like all he's focusing on is the beard. And he says, a beard on a blind man? Too much, I say. And although the reader might not agree or disagree with this, it definitely changes the experience, and you learn a lot about the narrator himself through the way he looks at the characters.
Yeah, I would like to add on that we could see it's like his strengths and weaknesses and how he, like in the beginning where he just started out pretty much not knowing who this character or who the blind man was, and then eventually going back. And I think this symbolism here symbolized in his perspective as like smoking a joint with him was like almost a test or almost like trusting him in a sense too.
Yeah, I think he mentions almost through every single event with, or every single interaction with the blind man, the narrator always references his beard. And I think his focus on the beard really detracts other aspects of the blind man that we as a reader will not know unless he focuses on, or unless we get a perspective from the blind man.
I definitely agree with you. I think I was actually noticing as I was reading that a lot of the description and the about like the setting and the events is all very visual, and I think that's just used to accentuate the difference between the narrator and the blind man. Because I mean, he talks about sitting down, like he sits down, he takes a drink, like everything is very visual, and it's stuff that the blind man wouldn't have picked up on, which just really shows their differences. And I think that's just another way to show kind of how the narrator himself doesn't have isn't able to see past the visual, which is the difference in him and the blind man.
Yeah, like referring back to your like difference in like perspectives, I also wanted to point out like his wife was also a key factor in shifting his perspective too, especially when she's kind of also like symbolically like an introduction to the blind man and a greater like relationship, like establishing a greater relationship between them to further on develop in the story. And like throughout the story, I noticed like his wife kept on, I don't want to say like poking, but like essentially like poking at him to like trying to get the blind man and him to, you know, cooperate in a sense.
I agree. I think she's a bridge between the blind man and narrator who would have never gotten along if it wasn't for her, because
Yeah.
she had living experience with both of them. One of she was the caretaker for the blind man, and she has a relationship with the narrator, and through that she could combine her experience and like, and it kind of, yeah, it helps, it supports the relationship between the blind man and the narrator in a sense.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And there's, you think of like events, like when they're all having a discussion after they eat dinner. And I don't have it up right here, but the narrator says something about how his wife is constantly trying to get him to participate. And it's interesting when you think about how that would look from the blind man's perspective, whereas he's kind of sitting in the corner, he's sulking, he isn't wanting to participate. But from the narrator's perspective, he's annoyed that his wife hasn't been talking about him. He says that he kept waiting for his wife to mention his name, which I think ties into the greater, just like his greater resentment of the relationship that the wife and the blind man have. I think partly because they're a lot closer and they have, I think, a deeper relationship, in my opinion, than the husband and the wife with the tapes and things like that. And I think he definitely has a resentment that he and his wife don't share that.
Yeah. Speaking of tapes, I also noticed I feel like a lot of external stuff like objects and the environment are also like another factor for the author to like the author kind of specifically chose these specific items and environments and settings, such as like I wanted to point out like inviting the blind man into the house. I feel like that's a really crucial significance for like establishing trust and building on like relationships and perspectives, because it's also kind of, I mean, first we start with tapes, which are just objects that you can just give, but then we start like inviting the guy completely to the house after knowing his story, and I find that really interesting too.
Tyson, I agree with what you have to say. And speaking of the environment and other objects other than these interacting with these characters, I want to segue into the deeper meaning of these objects, such as the TV and other parts of the house that we don't really see its meaning when we first look at them.
Yeah, so I think the most striking, like symbolic object in the story is also the title. It's the cathedral, and just the way that the narrator and the blind man interact with it very differently. And I think it's very interesting. It shows a lot about each of them. For me, I thought was what was most interesting is kind of watching the blind man or the narrator trying to explain what a cathedral looks like, and clearly he wasn't really able to do it, and it just shows how unable he is to like connect with another person. I thought that was interesting.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Oh,
oh,
sorry.
sorry, you
Carry
go
on.
ahead, Tyson.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I also I feel like even a bigger picture, literally a bigger picture of the cathedral. You notice how like, okay, ironically, like blind people can't see big objects. They can't completely, you know, because it's so big. They can only be like like only like feel a fraction of it to notice. But to see something so big, you need someone to either draw it out or explain it to them. And I feel like in this sense, the cathedral is like showing the bigger picture of like change and being able to interact with, having the narrator being able to interact with the blind man as a sense of like kind of a unifying sense, I guess you can put it.
I agree. As Henry said earlier, the narrator we see from the narrator's perspective only throughout this entire piece, and we notice that the narrator is very visual, which contrasts the blind man a lot. And in the end, when he actually attempts to do what the blind man usually does, what Robert usually does, which is draw the cathedral, he says there's a quote, and he said, well, from his perspective, he said that he doesn't open his eyes after he draws it, and I think that he's starting to know what it's like to not have something that he's always used throughout his entire life.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. As I said at the start of the podcast, this is like a moment of catharsis, and in this last moment is really, it's the most powerful moment in the entire book. And I think just the way that the cathedral is used to connect the two, and it's a physical connection with the narrators, or with the blind man's hand on the narrators as he draws it, and it's really emotional because he begins to see, like, obviously not see, but to think like the blind man does. I think throughout the whole thing, he kind of references a few times. He doesn't really understand why the blind man does something, or like his motivation, but at the end, in this kind of, it's almost bizarre, the moment they have together. It's like a mutual understanding, which I think comes through the cathedral.
Yeah, I think the mutual understanding also comes from the introduction of a new sense, which is touch, and that hasn't really been talked about through the entire story, except, well, yeah, it hasn't really been talked about in the entire story between the narrator and everyone. It's only been between the wife and the blind man, or something else. But I think the introduction of touch directly helps with their mutual understanding and their possible friendship.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like moving on with like another item was like the TV. Like I feel like that's a very obvious way of showing mutual understanding. Like, you know, blind man has a TV, but then he's blind, right? And then you're just, and then we see that we have this scene where in the story we're talking about him like playing the TV, and then the blind man was like, "Oh, it's okay, whatever you're playing." Like he was okay with whatever he was playing on the TV, even though the narrator is trying to be somewhat like trying to accommodate, his like, because he can't see and he only hears. He's trying to just accommodate what he wants to, maybe wants to expect him to hear, and trying to understand him a bit better in that sense too.
I also found it really funny that he was able to tell whether the TV was color or not.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think that I also want to talk about the fact that it was also mentioned in the story that he didn't have any glasses to cover his eyes, which were like wandering around. But I think that there's a greater meaning to that, because it kind of shows that he's not really blocked. His vision's not completely blocked just because he doesn't have eyesight, but he's still able to like do a lot of things other people do without having it. And like he has his own ways of going about like experiencing those experiences that people with vision have.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the glasses were interesting, and just like his eyes definitely being almost like a point of contention between the narrator and the blind man. I remember when the blind man is turned with his ear towards the TV, and he's almost looking at the narrator, looking towards him, and the narrator finds it very uncomfortable, and it's like a point of contention between the two. And I also wanted to just talk about. I was interested in talking about the TV. I feel like the TV ties in with there's some other things, like the food and kind of even the joint, when like everyday objects and just the way that they interact with them are very interesting. I think when he was describing the blind man and how he eats, and he wasn't afraid to like touch the food that he was eating. I think that was almost the first moment where he was able to like understand the motivation behind the blind man, and through these kind of everyday objects. And it's a very, the whole scene in the story is very everyday. It's just like a night they spend together, but through these kind of shared experiences and these objects, they're able to find a common ground.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I would
Thank
actually
you.
just want to move on to more towards the interactions between, like the dynamic between the in the dialogue and how the narrator used it to show development throughout the passage. Especially like at the beginning, we see a lot of wife and narrator, and then now near the end, we also see a bit more narrator and the blind man.
Yeah, I definitely think that the dialogue is a super important part of the piece. For me, the most striking thing was when the blind man arrives at their house and he starts talking with them, and just the way that he talks and the way that he interacts with them I found it completely different than how he was characterized by the narrator. He says bub, and he talks very familiarly with the characters, which I definitely thought it contrasted the way that the narrator described him. I think the reader expected him to not have many social skills, be very different than someone who could see, but he talks very confidently, and I think that just shows a lot about his character.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'd like to point at a specific quote near the end of the story. So when the wife said, "What's going on, Robert? What are you doing? What's going on?" She repeats, "What's going on?" And then after that, the blind man tells her that it's all right. So basically, I think the relationship at the beginning or the interactions are mostly between the blind man and the wife, and then later it shifts to the blind man, Robert, and the narrator. And I think the dialogue helps make that clear, especially this one right here.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think just dialogue being kind of a means to communicate that isn't visual at all, it's definitely used as a tool. As you were saying, at first, only the wife and the blind man can really communicate through this, effectively through this means. But then, as the narrator begins to be more comfortable with the blind man, he's able to like have a strong conversation with him as well, which is very telling about his growth.
Yeah, and definitely like the dialogue definitely sets the tone for the characters in the beginning of the passage. With like even I want to also specifically quote when the narrator actually specifically asked his wife about the blind man's wife and asking if his wife was a African American, and then the wife was saying like, "Are you crazy? How could you know? How could you be like very insensitive in a sense? I guess just making a random comment, and then overall, like over time, we could see that further down the passage, the wife is trying to with the dialogue kind of set like a more calmer tone and like trying. It's like even with like the weed also added up to like a more relaxed and more conversational tone and trying to develop understanding in a sense too.
I also think that so I remember there was this part where the narrator was feeling uncomfortable by the fact that like when Robert was trying to listen to the TV, he was also looking or not looking, but like he was facing the narrator, and the narrator, even though he knows he's blind, he still believes that, or he still has like a sense of like discomfort. In the end, he says it says that like he so the blind man knows him a little bit by the end of the story, and he says, and he thinks that all he worries about is the visuals. The narrator only cares about what he sees, and this is shown through dialogue when he repeatedly tells the narrator to be like, "Oh, take a look. What do you think?" And then after a little bit, he still persists and says, "Oh, well, are you looking?" So I think that plays into the idea that like the narrator has changed in a sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think that was also demonstrated just like again, just talking about his interactions, the narrators with the blind man, and their dialogue together. One thing that I thought was really interesting was, especially at the start, before he kind of changes and is able to connect with him better, there's a very clear difference between his narration and then the actual blind man, or the actual dialogue he shares with the blind man. I come to the quote where he's talking about he's getting the blind man a glass of scotch, and they just have a little back and forth. "A little water with the scotch," I said. "Very little," he said. "I knew it," I said. And it's very familiar, and it's very friendly, and it's clear that in their conversation he's almost he's pretending to be comfortable with the blind man, even though just before that he was complaining about how he wished he had glasses and he's very uncomfortable around him. And it definitely, that part in particular shows kind of how uncomfortable he was with the blind man versus, how he was talking to him.
Yeah, and in addition, like I think adding on to being comfortable, I feel like comfort is also a theme in this passage. Like in dialogue specifically, when the wife was talking to the blind man, making sure I'm comfortable, the blind man said. I want you to feel comfortable in this house, she said. I am comfortable. Like this sense of assurance of making sure everyone's comfortable with each other is, I think, like a necessity further on in the story, and then that's what led to the narrator becoming more and more understanding and opening up a bit more with the blind man in relation to that too.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And combining perspective, like we talked earlier, and dialogue, I say like if we didn't have the dialogue, we would again lose like even we would be only limited. We would be limited to the narrator's thoughts and not like their direct interaction. And at least with the dialogue, we get a little sense of what the other characters are like truly, because it's facts and it's exactly what they say, and we can like read into that. But without dialogue, you wouldn't really have any insight into any other characters but the narrator.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think like the other minor characters that are seen throughout the story, you don't get that dialogue with that, which I think is pretty interesting. Like there's that one part he talks about the officer who his wife used to be engaged to or married to, and he doesn't give him his name. I forget the actual quote, but he says like, why does he deserve a name? Like he was his childhood sweetheart. What more does he want? So I think when he's describing him and also Beulah, you don't get that narration, which is I think definitely like the unreliable narrator definitely shines in those instances.
I think these other characters, I'll say minor characters, are really important in rounding out these main characters like the wife, the blind man, and the narrator. But I think the wife is also main part of the development of character of Robert and narrator, because she seems to stay static the entire time in character. She doesn't change much. She's not as dynamic like the other two characters, and I think this really like highlights the relationship and growth in relationship between Robert and the narrator.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it was quite interesting that at the start of the story and kind of even through like the middle, the narrator is kind of portrayed as like backwards a little bit and like talking about the wife, like talking about the blind man's wife and stuff like that. And the narrator's wife is kind of more aware of like issues and things like that. But by the end of the story, I kind of felt like they completely switched roles, right? Like the blind man and the narrator had kind of their relationship had reached a new level.
Yeah.
And then the wife wakes up from her nap and she's like, what are you doing? Like, I don't understand.
Mhm.
And it was very interesting that the narrator had like reached such a understanding with the blind man that he was kind of like understood him more than his wife, which I thought was a huge change.
Yeah, and I also thought, speaking of like the interactions between the two, we also see that the blind man also sort of grew throughout the passage as we don't really know about him much. Well, we don't really know much about him in the first few pages, but then over time we learn. Well, the narrator learns about the loss of his wife, and then a loss of the blind man's wife, excuse me, and then becomes more understanding throughout the passage, and then actual interaction where he comes into the house and then learns more about the narrator, and then even he's went to the extent of even smoking weed with the narrator, and not even like revealing the side of him specifically to the which is essentially another turning point for him and the narrator. And like what you said, when they were working towards like reaching new levels throughout their relationship and interaction, you could see further down that near the end the realization that the blind man could actually have a greater understanding, and then eventually near the end is like I would say, in my opinion, the wholesome end to realizing that the blind man could be like the narrator could help out the blind man, and the blind man could like cooperate well.
Okay, so we're talking about character development here. And I'd just like to ask a question to anyone who wants to answer. So, do you think the blind man actually changed?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question that I was kind of thinking about, and like, because on the one hand, the blind man and the narrator do kind of reach this understanding that they weren't able to reach before, but on the other hand, this change is led by the blind man in a way. So I guess I personally didn't really see a big change of the blind man. I don't know if Tyson, you want to add to this, but I felt like this entire time, kind of the blind man, maybe even because of his blindness, he kind of like exists on a higher understanding than the narrator, and he kind of lifted the narrator up to this. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I actually agree with you on that. I mean, I feel like the central idea of this past, like the central, because the narrator is essentially the protagonist in the story, we see the greatest change in him, but we do see some minor changes in the the blind man himself, as he was willing to do something that the wife didn't even know about, and I think that's that's him like developing throughout that passage in that specific scene. And then I feel like, if in a sense, he definitely does seem to have higher understanding, especially when the narrator tested him with some questions. It's like kind of like they have this sort of mutual understanding now that despite him being blind, he was able to notice, in a sense, have the correct responses, subconsciously just know it, and we could see that in this passage, which is quite nice too.
Hmm.
I agree with Henry, but to a lesser extent, because I think there's like a hierarchy of like people who changed here. So I think the person who changed the most was the narrator. I think we could all agree.
Hmm.
Um, and I think the change is more long lasting as well. But I think the blind man is more dynamic than the wife for sure, meaning that he like changed in character because he did make some temporary changes, like we talked about the marijuana, and that's just to get to an understanding. And that these temporary changes are changes, but they changes in his character, but they're definitely not as impactful to his like overall character as the changes to the narrator. Like I think the changes to narrator were more long lasting and that they're gonna affect his personality and like character in the long term.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Well, I think this would be a good stopping point. We had some great discussion about Cathedral. We get to see the interactions between the characters in the story, and we get to see how they view their perspectives, and how basically the author included deeper meaning in objects and environment to show development and growth. And I thought that was pretty great. So thanks, Henry, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. I had a great time.
The Chris and Tyson podcast is made possible by viewers like you, as well as our sponsor, Apple. Think different. Pre-order the iPhone 12 starting on October 16th. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week with Jonathan Franzen.